It seems to me that consequences are mattering less and less. We live in a culture where there's a general loss of decorum and manners. It seems that those who are in leadership and influence over us have an anything goes mentality, as long as there's not a cell phone camera around to capture what they're doing. Then perhaps maybe we'll be a little bit remorseful. I mean, the viral video this past week from YouTube about this NYPD officer from Sayville who was berating the Uber cab driver for honking at him is sad on so many levels. First of all, I don't know if we would have been hearing about this news if there wasn't a video of this. And that then leads to the question, how often does this go on where it's not caught on tape? Then we have our public officials like Hillary Clinton, who her latest controversy is this question of whether or not it was right for her to use her personal email to do State Department business when she was the Secretary of State. And it appears like she's getting away with this, which for me is laughable. Because when I worked for Thrivent Financial for Lutherans, they pounded into us on a regular basis how you should never ever use your own personal email to carry out business, especially delicate business of people's finances. And they had figured out a way that we could have our same phone and have a business email and then a personal email. If a small little Lutheran financial company understands the importance of this and can figure it out so they don't have to have prying eyes into our personal lives, it's a wonder that somebody who held the position of Secretary of State and aspires to hold the most powerful position in the world can't quite figure this out. Then we've got our lawmakers here in New York. The State Assembly is on the verge of passing an ethics bill because things have gotten so out of hand. How sad is it that those who make our laws have to have a bill passed to keep them in line to do the right thing? It's tragic. It's sad. We're surrounded by this anything goes culture where do what you want as long as you want, as long as it doesn't hurt anyone else, and as long as you don't get caught and nobody else sees it. And this is all well and good until somebody gets hurt, until something goes seriously wrong. And as much as we may think there are no consequences for things, as much as we may want to ignore the outcome of actions or the things that are wrong in our lives, inevitably the reality and the effects of sin slap us in the face, and they cannot be ignored anymore. And oftentimes the consequences of those actions are devastating and deadly. And sometimes the most disastrous of those consequences are those things that happen not because we just outrightly break what is good and what is right, but those tragic events that come from just simple mistakes, little imperfections that surround us in our life in this world. A few months ago, we heard the very sad story out of Westchester about this mother whose car stopped a little bit too far beyond the railroad gate. It was just a few inches, but those few inches, as we know, had a disastrous, deadly, tragic result. And over the last few days, we've been bombarded with that news from France. This pilot struggling with depression, ignoring the advice of his doctors, those supervisors above him not realizing the severity of it. And in his own despair and suicide, he takes how many people with him? It's into this world we gather here tonight for Good Friday. It's a weird name, isn't it? Because two words I don't think you'd ever put together are good and death. Why is it called Good Friday anyway? Well, it goes to the same reason why we say goodbye to each other. Goodbye comes from the old Anglo-Saxon way of saying farewell to somebody else. Back in the day when people parted from one another's company because life was so fragile, they would offer a blessing to each other saying, God be with ye. over the course of time, it's been shortened to our very polite goodbye. You know, if a lot of these secularists really understood what it really meant to say goodbye, they would be working very hard to get rid of that, because you don't want to have a blessing, a God be with ye blessing, for anyone else. So Good Friday used to be known as God's Friday. And over the course of time, it was lengthened to become Good Friday. But before it was known as Good Friday, it was known as the triumph of the cross. Again, there appears to be that contradiction. An oxymoron, like jumbo shrimp, like parking in a driveway or driving on a parkway. It doesn't quite make sense how, when we look at the cross, when we hear in a little while the 7 last words of Jesus as he suffered on the cross, how there can be any triumph in it. But when we come to understand that, we come to see again why today is good and powerful for us. Walter Warringren is a name known to a lot of pastors, because he was a pastor and a scholar who wrote some of the authoritative works for dealing with biblical languages, and particularly Hebrew. So at one point, a pastor during their seminary training picks up Warringren's work on Hebrew and reading the Bible. But he was also a very good pastor, and one of the things that he worked on in English is he wrote a short story, a fictional short story one day, that he entitled The Rag Man. It was to drive home the power of what this day was all about. He tells the story of this man who was known as the Rag Man. He would travel from town to town, dragging behind him a wooden cart, and on the wooden cart he would have all sorts of new clothes. When he came into a town, he would make the announcement, "Trade your old for new, come get new clothes, give me your old clothes, get rid of the dirt, the stink, and I'll give you something brand new." So he came into this town. The first woman he encounters is a woman sitting on her front porch. She's holding a dirty old handkerchief, and she's crying. He walks up to her with a handkerchief. He takes off his cart, gives it to her. She's confused by it. He has to pry open her hand and take her dirty handkerchief out of her hand. He then rubs his own cheeks with the handkerchief, and he begins to cry. Places the dirty handkerchief on the cart, and he moves along. Then he encounters this young girl who's got dirty, crusty, bloody bandages all around her head. He grabs a beautiful bonnet off his cart, walks up to her, gently and delicately unwraps her head, touches the wound, and it's healed. And he puts the beautiful new bonnet on her. He then takes the bandage, wraps his own head, and it begins to bleed. He then moves on to the next person, sees him sitting on the side of the road, slumped over, and he says to him, "Why aren't you working?" And the man stands up, and his sleeve is just hanging there. He has no arm, and he says, "I can't work." So he says, "I'll trade you my shirt for your shirt." He takes off his shirt, and he gives it to the man, and he takes the man's shirt. But when he puts the shirt on, then the rag man, the sleeve is just hanging there. And the man with the new shirt has a new arm. And this continues as he visits from one person to the next, making this exchange, and the pile grows bigger and bigger on the carts. And by the end of the day, he comes to the center of the town. He's exhausted. The cart reeks of dirt, sickness, and everything that was wrong, the results and consequences of a sinful, broken world. But it can't stay there in the middle of the town. So with his one arm, he drags it out of the town up onto a hill. When he finally gets to the top of the hill, the ragman collapses on the wood of the cart. The next day, he awakens, alive, in beautiful new clothing. The cart is gone, showing the triumph of grace and forgiveness. It's hard for us to look at sin. It's hard for us to admit to the consequences of sin. But what makes this day good is that assurance and that blessing that we don't have to face it alone. And what's more than that is the incredible message and assurance to us that not only are we not alone, but the one who is with us is willing to take all that dirt, all that garbage, all that baggage onto himself and take it out of our lives. So those consequences, that wretched smell, doesn't have to last. See, to live life without recognizing the consequences of sin and that we have help leads to hopelessness and despair. And if you need proof of this, just look at the way the world tries to deal with these things. Hopefully people are in counseling. That's a good result. That's a good way of dealing with it. But how many other people have fallen to addictions, drug, alcohol, and abuse, and other addictions in order to cope with the struggles and the consequences of a broken, sinful world in which they live? What makes today good is that blessed assurance that we don't have to deal with those things alone. And they don't have to overwhelm our lives. And that in Christ and his cross, his substitution for us, the slate is wiped clean. What we heard about in the Hebrew epistle lesson, where we are reminded that God says to us, I will remember their sins and lawless deeds no more. There was a young Catholic priest down in the Philippines that every single day of his life he struggled with a sin that he could not forgive himself for. He had done something terrible during his time studying at the seminary. And even though he tried to lay it before God in confession, he never really felt like he was freed from it and he was forgiven. No one else in the world knew about it. But he knew God knew about it. So he was serving at this church in the Philippines, and he had a woman in his congregation who was known as a mystic. He wasn't happy about this because it seemed to apparently contradict everything that he was trying to teach to the people in regards to faith. So in order to disprove her ability and prove her as a fraud, one day he challenged her because she said she would talk to Christ. She could see things and know things. So he said to her, okay, the next time you're talking to Jesus, I want you to ask him what I did that was so terrible and sinful when I was in the seminary. So she said, okay, and went on. So the next time she came to church, he asked her, so, did you talk to Jesus? She said, yeah, I did. He says, okay, well, what did he say? What did I do so wrong? And she looked at him and she said, that Jesus said, I don't remember. And with that, the slate was wiped clean. It's hard for us to look at the cross. We don't like to stay at the cross. Look around you at the wood and the emptiness compared to what it'll look like on Sunday. We're not comfortable here. But this is good for us to be here. For we recognize the struggle, the pain, the suffering, so that we then submit ourselves to the one who helps us. And the assurance and the blessing that we do have is we overcome always. Amen.